This is the Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Maria Armoudian. In this hour, an analysis of the historical roots of the present-day political turmoils, divisions, and partisanship in the United States, the fault lines that fractured the U.S. Julian Zelizer is a professor of history and public affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. He's the author of Arsenal of Democracy, The Politics of National Security from World War II to the War on Terrorism, On Capitol Hill, The Struggle to Reform Congress and Its Consequences, 1948 to 2000, and his latest, Fault Lines, A History of the United States Since 1974. Welcome back to the Scholars Circle. It's great to have you back, Julian Zelizer.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with the title, Fault Lines, as in earthquakes, as in faults under a looming earthquake, which I suppose in this particular book is about this divided, polarized America. Is that how you meant this?
Yeah, that's how we meant it. We're trying to trace over 4 decades of these very deep divisions that have separated different parts of American society and which created the path to where we are today. There are the political fault lines between the two parties as they've moved further apart, the economic fault lines as you've had a increased division between the rich and the poor in this country and an increasingly fragile middle class, the racial fault lines that have continued to haunt this country even after the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And finally, the fault lines we talk about around sexuality and gender, which have been issues front and center also since the 1970s. And so we do want to emphasize how deep the divisions are and how they've influenced the character of our public square.
Do you have a sense that these divisions would not be so deep and so pronounced had we not had some provocateurs, so to speak?
There's something to that. We don't argue that all of these divisions kind of bubble up from the bottom up. So they're not all a product of how Americans feel very clearly on every issue. They're often provoked either by provocateurs or by the way our institutions have worked during this period. So in terms of the institutions, we look at how party politics was remade after Richard Nixon to really promote and incentivize partisanship. And then within this world, we look at figures such in the media, for example, like Rush Limbaugh, who was a conservative talk radio host who in the late 1990s worked in the new media environment that had taken form and really tried to play to the base, as we say today, and to stimulate those feelings of division for their own purposes. So there are very real divisions and tensions over many of the big issues of this period. But the key is that we don't have institutions anymore that push against it. We have institutions that actually try to promote this, and the people within those make their living and gain their power by fostering division.
Let's talk about those institutions. Obviously, the media institutions are one of them. And so you've got this polarization that you started the book with and then continued on discussing. Do you see this as the chicken or the egg?
We think the media is actually, it's a chicken. And we try to trace the history from when you had a few network channels, CBS, ABC, and NBC here in the States, really were the only sources of news and the handful of major city papers, to a period that starts with the advent of cable television in the 1980s and the 24-hour news cycle, moving forward into the partisan era of news that you see take form in the 1990s with Fox News and talk radio, into the era of social media where there are no filters anymore on information. It's very easy to get information out, and it's very hard to control what's in our public square. And that history is really important, not just because it reflects a divided country or it reflects the polarization. It actually fuels it. More people get their information about politics from news sources that will only give it to them from one point of view. Politicians employ the media. They use the media to advance their agenda. And And as we see with President Trump and Fox News, for example, it's a pretty powerful alliance, and it really does help to foment some of the tensions that we see today, like the debate over this caravan.
So, yeah, it's interesting about the provocateurs who clearly benefit from this kind of chaos. And in this new environment that you describe, it seems people get rewarded for hostility and punished for, sane, rational discourse.
That's exactly right. So in the world of the media, 2018, 2019, meaning this world we created, there's very little benefit to giving level-headed, nonpartisan analysis of what's going on in Washington. But instead, if you say something provocative, what's called, clickbait statements, clickbait headlines, you're much more likely to gain an audience. And in the way the news media works today, audiences matter, whether you're talking about the ratings for television networks or you're talking about the hits or the likes that a social media site or a tweet receives. That's why the incentives work that way. And it's the same in politics. People talk about the problem of how gerrymandered our districts are. The reason that's a problem is members of the House of Representatives look back to their electorate and they understand that if they try to play to a center, they will lose office. So the way to keep your power is to play to the base, to play to the most active in your constituency. So the incentives help understand why the world works the way it does here in the States.
So if you were going to pinpoint timing, you looked around 1974 for this particular book. Why that particular era and those years?
Yeah, we argue that in the 70s that a lot of many of the there were some institutions in the post-World War II period, the 1940s and 50s, that pushed against the divisions that existed in that era. And so, for example, the very strong role of the federal government provided a common thread through much of the country during that period. The era of network news certainly didn't allay all the divisions in society, but it provided a common point of information. And even unions were very important in the economy, and they connected different social groups and different sectors of society through this workplace institution. And what you see in the 70s is a lot of these fall apart as a result of the crises that the nation goes through. And we start the book in 74 because that's when President Richard Nixon steps down for an office. He resigns in one of the worst scandals in American history. That moment itself is traumatic and I think important moment to begin our exploration of the current period, but it also brings together many of the tensions that had been bubbling up over Vietnam, over domestic relations, over the presidency. And we believe that's really when the transition happens. And you could even see it in the economy, for example, as we move into our current high-tech service sector-based economy.
I wonder a little bit if maybe that moment when Richard Nixon steps down in what was then the big scandal, which today would probably not be such a huge scandal given what we're facing. Like maybe that's worth a contrast at some point. But maybe what's happened is that it just brought it to the surface.
I think that's exactly right. And that was the discovery of Nixon's resignation. There were many people in the country that hoped it would heal the nation and it would resolve our problems of having a president with too much power. That was the idea. Well, the process worked, the system worked. But really, Nixon was a product of several decades when the presidency had been gaining a lot of power, and we had seen an executive branch that looked very different than what we had in the 19th century. And with Nixon, it had just gotten in the wrong hands, so to speak. And so when he steps down the presidency, there are reforms, there are efforts to constrain the presidency on making war power, even on the budget. But in the end, they're of limited effect. And the presidency will regain its strength and even get stronger, we argue, by the 1980s and 1990s. And so that's why what you're saying is very important to understand. And it also helps explain part of why Nixon's resignation on its own didn't cure the problem.
You talked about in the book a particular Supreme Court decision, and I want to bring this out because there's a lot of focus on Citizens United as a really detrimental decision that the Supreme Court made, which I would agree with. But really its predecessor, which you talk about, Buckley v. Valeo, was perhaps the turning point in terms of issues around corruption and electoral integrity and gaining power for the extreme wealthy. And how would you see that?
No, it's a really important decision. One of the positive beneficial effects of 1974 and the crisis of Watergate had been that it stimulated Congress to pass campaign finance reform legislation. And the legislation included a number of provisions, including a public finance system for presidential election. It included limits on contribution. And quite dramatically now, in retrospect, it also included limits on how much could be spent in elections. And all of this was an effort to undercut the power of money in American politics, because Congress realized that was part of what was going on with Richard Nixon. Some of the scandal involved the impact of money on public policy making, but the Supreme Court knocks a key part of that down in this Buckley v. Valeo decision, and they decide that congressional limits on campaign spending was an unconstitutional violation of free speech. And the idea was spending money in elections was the same as free speech and the ability to say what you want. And from that point on, a key reform, a key accomplishment of the post-Watergate era is undercut, because while you still have limits on how much people could raise, you don't have the same kind of limits on how much people could spend. And the pressure will keep mounting. And it also allows wealthy individuals to spend huge amounts on their own campaign, which will become relevant in recent years with some independent candidacy.
And turned money into speech, which I think is highly significant as well.
Yeah, and right after, in the years that follow Buckley, between 76 and the early 80s, you see this expansion in Washington of corporations, not just umbrella associations in a particular industry, but even companies set up shop in Washington on what's called K Street, and they form lobbying groups, and those lobbying groups really depend on these new campaign finance rules to exert influence. And the flood of money starts then. It's only gotten worse. And Citizens United made it worse. The president's abandoning the public finance system made it worse. But the origins of this are in that 1976 moment when the reforms were undercut just 2 years after being put into law.
And so that was a new phenomenon. And now, of course, we face the sort of unbridled, I don't know what to call it. It's not just, it's like a legalized corruption, I suppose, because it's removed the democratic element.
Yeah, that's the fear of what's going on today. It hasn't totally removed it, and that voters can still vote,
That's right.
and they obviously they can change the country, as we've just seen. That said, money is very significant, and what it does, not just in elections, but in policymaking, it creates a system of unequal access. If you have money and you have the capacity to donate, the access you get to make your case to a legislator or to the president is much greater than your average citizen has. And that's where inequality is very real in the political system and undercuts some of the election. And it obviously has effects in elections themselves, in that while voters still matter and grassroots movements matter, people with money, organizations with money can really sway elections. And so this is a problem in our current life that shouldn't be discounted.
So then you talk a bit about Jimmy Carter, and you showed him as sort of this antidote to Watergate and all it represented. But your assessment of his presidency is quite mixed. In hindsight, how do you assess Jimmy Carter?
Yeah, well, I guess one way to look at him is someone who was more successful on policy than we remember, but really not very good on politics. So in terms of policy, there are a number of accomplishments that were significant, even over time. He's really the first president to put the problem of energy and conservation on the agenda in a very serious manner. He introduces human rights as a permanent concern in U.S. foreign policy. And the Camp David peace accord between Egypt and Israel is quite remarkable, given it's one of the few achievements of peace in that region. It lasted for decades. But politically, Carter never was able to rebuild the Democratic coalition that had withered in the 1960s. He's not particularly concerned with that part of the presidency, and he doesn't leave his party any more united by 1980 than it was when he took over in 1976. And that has a cost. It helps create a path for Ronald Reagan to come into office and for a conservative movement that had taken form in the 70s to enter into the halls of power. And so that's a kind of mixed assessment of what he did.
Yeah, it's sort of like he was a visionary in terms of the future, but in terms of leadership for politics, for the nuts and bolts of elections and campaigns, not so much.
Right, and there's a cost to that, meaning you can't disconnect politics from policy, in that his achievements come under threat during the 1980s. And many of the ideas he wasn't able to fulfill don't find much support in the new conservative era of politics, because the person in power, Reagan, and the Republicans in Congress have little appetite for a lot of what he wanted. So I think Carter saw the cost of not doing more on politics, not doing more to focus on the health of his party as much as the ideas that mattered to him much more.
You also noted the role of oil in the economy and the politics of the world. What was oil's role in the fault lines and the loss of confidence in the economy?
Well, it was very important in that during the 1970s, the U.S. goes through an energy crisis, which includes two major crises points when OPEC it limits the supply and thus increases the prices of oil. And in 1973 through 74 and in 1979, Americans are facing massive gas lines and shortage of supplies. And it fuels a sense in the 70s that our economy was no longer what it had been a decade or two earlier, that we were no longer in what was called the American century, where our economic institutions, our companies, were the strongest in the world. And the oil crisis is part of a general economic crisis that's very real. Not only are we unable to control our energy usage and energy prices, but the entire manufacturing sector of the economy, which depended on that oil, is starting to really weaken and lose in competition to countries such as Japan and West Germany. And Americans suffer as a result of all this what's called stagflation, the combination of inflation and high unemployment, which economists always said couldn't happen hand in hand. And so when Carter finishes his presidency in 1980, part of the reason so many voters are frustrated and want something new is they are struggling. They're facing high prices, they don't have enough gas for their cars, and they don't have jobs. And it felt, if you were living in 79 and 1980, for many Americans, like the bottom had just totally fallen out of an economy which used to almost guarantee that your kids would do better than you would.
So let's turn to race and ethnicity. You said that most Americans, welcome the dismantling of segregation. Why did it contribute to the chaos?
Well, the shift that happens that we really hone in on in the 70s is the nation has done a lot Congress has passed the Civil Rights Act, which is about legal segregation, passes in 1965 the Voting Rights Act, which is about voting discrimination. But the problem that was on the table in the late 60s was what's called institutional racism, the way in which racial injustice and division is inscribed into our institutions. And so even if people are not openly being racist, they participate in a system that keeps perpetuating racial injustice. The way that real estate worked, for example, and housing is one example that people point to. The way our education system was set up created unequal access to good education, or the way criminal justice worked constantly created pressures and dangers for African Americans that didn't exist for the rest of the country, as we've seen recently on policing. And this is a problem that we don't ever form some consensus around. There's no big legislative breakthroughs on how to deal with institutional racism. And this is a problem that affects the North as much as the South. So as civil rights activists started to push the agenda into this area, the tensions became much more severe around the country. It was no longer a regional fault line. This was something that was very much inscribed in our politics. And some politicians play to it for their own advantage. We talk about Lee Atwater, who ran George H.W. Bush's 1988 presidential campaign against Michael Dukakis, and the way in which he used race in certain advertisements to play on these feelings that still were very much alive and well in 1980s America.
So again, we come back to this idea of provocateurs, and provocateurs for their own self-enrichment, so to speak, even if it's political enrichment, not monetary.
That's right. And both are equally important. And obviously, in the world of politics, power is as much the commodity that's traded as money. And there are just a lot of incentives in this partisan polarization we've been talking about, certainly for parts of the Republican Party, to mesh those with racial division. And that goes right through the Trump administration. But there were actual incentives for them to do that. And they were used more frequently than we remember.
So let's turn to the cultural issues around gender, sexuality, the family. You noted that feminism really arose from chronic discrimination, particularly in the workplace.
Yeah, well, this is really important. I mean, one of the things, we trace the feminist movement of the 70s and the transformations that it achieves and the limits of what it achieves. And we really tried to bring in a lot of the scholarship on the workplace. And the way, one of the interesting stories is the feminist movement, the awakening of feminism, and it's becoming a national political movement, converges in the 70s with this economic crisis we were talking about. And you have more women entering into the workforce as much for pragmatic needs as anything else. The idea of a single wage earning family is becoming less tenable by the 1970s. And so this, changes notions of gender, changes place, ideas of work. In part, it's just a response to the new realities of 1970s America. And it has a big impact. You have, feminist organizations are taking form, and they're increasing in terms of their strength during this decade. You see a proliferation of publications like Ms. Magazine, which are starting to focus on questions like sexual harassment at the workplace. And you have some, although it's much slower, increasing presence of female politicians at the national and state level. But the economic part of that story we're really interested in, and it connected these two aspects of our story.
And then, of course, the move for equality for gay, lesbian, transgender people as well. Yeah,
that's a story that usually receives less attention until recently. If you look in the trail, at the end of textbooks, which usually end in the 1970s, it's on the radar. They usually will talk about the Stonewall Rebellion, which was a riot in New York City at a bar in response to police harassment. But the gay rights movement is really, it's quite a powerful force by the 1980s. It starts by talking about issues such as same-sex marriage. You already have protests on that particular question, and the rights of gay Americans on issues like police harassment. But in the 80s, it's really a moment we write a lot about this as a counterpoint to the Reagan Revolution. And where you really see its power is with the AIDS crisis. Initially, when this disease starts to ravage the U.S., what's striking is the Reagan administration totally ignores it. Ronald Reagan won't talk about he won't even use the word. There's one story we tell where Larry Speaks, the spokesperson for the president, is talking to reporters, and he makes jokes about AIDS. Kind of, there's no one in the White House who would have this. And what's remarkable is the movement organizes ACT UP Forms, which is a group that demands government attention to this issue. By the end of the Reagan administration, the attention is starting to be paid to the issue. And fast forward to George W. Bush, who's a Republican conservative president. In 2005, he launches a massive initiative to fight AIDS in Africa. And all of this isn't just the natural evolution of the country. It's a result of this gay rights movement that puts these issues of sexuality and family directly on the table.
Now, of course, we have Dick Cheney in that White House, who is torn between the culture wars because of his daughter.
Yeah, he's a really interesting figure. Cheney is a Republican who's first part of the Ford administration. He's then in Congress in the 1980s, and Secretary of Defense under George H.W. Bush, and he's a staunch conservative. But this is an issue where, in part because of his family, he's not on the same page as the religious right, which is such an important part of the conservative movement. And it comes up when he is running as vice president and debating, and this issue is brought up by John Edwards in 2004. It backfires when it's used against him. But why it's interesting, it reflects this is one question where that red-blue divide starts to soften, and some of the cultural changes go well beyond blue states versus red states. And you can see this, and you can see this today in how a lot of the Republican Party has shed some of that antagonism toward gay rights issues, which back in the 1980s were almost an orthodoxy for a lot of the party.
Yes. So now if we could come full circle to today, how do you connect all of these dots to where we are today? The culture wars and the crises we saw with the integrity of the government, the lack of confidence in the government, the deep polarization. Now what?
Well, we made a world coming out of the 1960s, which we're still living in. And the first thing you need to do is to understand that our current turmoil, whether you're talking about President Trump or whether you're talking about these intense battles over social issues such as reproductive rights, are not new. They're not even 5 or 10 years old. They're over 4 decades old, which means they're really cooked. They're baked into our culture, into our institutions, and they're going to be around for a while. But if you take someone like President Trump and you look at, for example, why does he govern this way? Why does he use the rhetoric that he does? Why is he so focused on conservative cable television? Why is he playing issues like immigration restriction and now late-term abortions? It's part because this is how the Republican Party has been evolving for a long time, and it was kind of predictable that it was going to end up here. So it certainly doesn't solve your problems, but it gives you a better sense of how deeply rooted what we're watching today and what troubles so many people is. The only solution it points to is you have to look back to the roots. If you're serious and say this is not tolerable and we need to change the way our politics work, it's going to take the kind of thing you saw in the 70s, where the political reform is a big issue that people take seriously. how does money work in politics? How do we handle the districting process? Media organizations have to look deep at how do we produce the news and what kind of alternatives do we offer viewers, readers, and listeners. Until those kinds of questions are asked, we might have a tamer version of what we see in 2019, but it won't fundamentally change. And for us, that's what the history really points to.
And I think that the incentives today are just really strong to keep them, if that makes sense. So even if we were to look back and to say, okay, well, this is just really abhorrent to me. It's costing us democratic governance, whatever, integrity, the corruption, the inequality. But when you look at it, you go, but the incentives are so strong for so many people to hold up this system.
That's absolutely true. And if we look at our own book, there's two sources of potential change that we see in the period we study. One is just a major crisis or scandal. I mean, the book starts with Watergate, and it shows what a scandal of that magnitude can do to the body politic, how it could shake things up and move us in a different direction. So that is obviously on the table as we speak, given what's going on with the White House under President Trump. The second part of the story, which I think is relevant today, is consistently throughout this period, even with the divisions and dysfunction, social movements have been able to reshape our ideas and push politics in new directions. So whether it was the conservative movement in the 70s, giving rise to ideas such as, defending the family through certain principles, or the gay rights movement and the impact it had on AIDS research and marriage, to the Parkland students recently who mobilized and have been putting a lot of pressure on the table on gun control. Social movements, like a scandal, have the ability to move us. So it's going to be very difficult, and the odds are it won't happen quickly, but the system is never static. And the best part of the story is when it changes, it's often average citizens who get together and care about a problem who are able to have the biggest impact on our bigger history.
Two questions for you on that. One is, do you think that from Watergate to today, and there have been a lot of other little crises that went along between then and now we're dealing with the current one, but do you think Americans are really quite inured?
I don't know. I mean, I think we have a fragile system, and we often take it for granted. And I think what we're seeing globally now suggests just how fragile our democratic institutions are. And I think if you're just an American watching presidential politics, you see all these assumptions you have about how things will work or how systems will be checked. Doesn't actually turn out that way all the time. And I don't know kind of where a lot of the country is on this. I don't know if they are sensitive to it. I don't know if they're numb to it. That at a certain level, this is what it is. This is what it's going to be. And they will just let it happen. But I think one of the effects of President Trump has been to call attention to some of these flaws or these problems and challenges that we are facing. And you're seeing that with Brexit overseas, and in many other countries. And the best kind of outcome is that actually pushes some kind of discussion and deliberation about doing something about the risks we face.
And then the other question, I said there were two, deals with what you said about social movements. And I think about what you said in terms of, well, it's not going to happen quickly. It'll happen over time because that's how social movements work. We've got sort of these idea entrepreneurs, and they carry these ideas and broadcast them and platform them, and people sign on to them. But I don't think we have ever had a time when we were under such an existential threat to the point, because of climate change, to the point where I'm not sure we've got the time. How do social movements function when they need time, when we don't really have time, given how much that will exacerbate all of the other problems?
That's a $1 million question, and that's a challenge that's ominous. Meaning, it is a particular kind of crisis, unlike even a national security crisis or unlike certain economic crises, where the last minute response, which we often depend on or have relied on, won't work. That you reach a tipping point, and we hope we're not there yet, where you can't reverse the damage. You can only do very little to curb the effects. And climate change is one of those challenges or crises that will affect everything else, from public health to our economic well-being. It seems there's still time. And it does seem that at least in party politics in the U.S., one party is pretty much on board with trying to take government actions right now to try to curb the impact, as are some parts of the corporate sector and some states. So it's not hopeless. There is a will there. It's not as if it's devoid, our political system, of any strong support. But it will take environmental activists who have been really changing public ideas successfully since the 70s to crack through this gridlocked moment we're in. And I do think it's going to be a partisan issue. I think it will come, if it comes, when Republicans, feel the consequences of the direction they've taken on some of these issues. A little bit like 1964, after Barry Goldwater lost in a massive landslide to Lyndon Johnson, and it opened the door for Democrats to push things like civil rights and Medicare that had been locked up for so long. You need a combination of grassroots and dramatic elections. That's the only way this is going to happen. But you're right. It has to happen soon. We can't wait 10 or 15 years for it.
Yeah, we no longer have that time that we had in the era of previous social movements. Final words, final thoughts?
Well, final thoughts are we hope, we wrote a book about the history that history classes never look at. And it's the story of our lives. My co-author and I both lived through this period. So we worked hard to try to make sense of what we lived through and what many of our readers lived through. But we do believe that studying this history, understanding it more as history just than what you remember, hopefully will help at least stimulate the conversations we've had today, and even better, actually create some momentum to solutions for some of these big challenges we're facing. And we hope the history is at least part of that mix.
The book, again, is called Fault Lines, A History of the United States Since 1974. And we've been speaking with Professor Julian Zelizer, who is a co-author of the book, along with Kevin Cruz. Thank you so much again for being with us here on the Scholar Circle.
Thanks so much for having me.
Julian Zelizer is a professor of history and public affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. He is the author of Arsenal of Democracy, The Politics of National Security from World War II to the War on Terrorism, On Capitol Hill, The Struggle to Reform Congress and Its Consequences, 1948 to 2000, and his latest, Fault Lines, A History of the United States Since 1974. And that's it for today's show. Thank you to all of our guests and to those who make this program possible. To Sud Dongre, our webmaster, Ankine Arasian, Melissa Chiprin, Mike Hurst, and Tim Page. Most of all, thank you for listening. If you missed part of the show, you can check out our archives at scholarcircle.org, kpfk.org, and please like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter at Armoudian, and we'll see you next week.